So if you want to just start off just for, as a practical matter, just say your name and spell it for us so we have the
Sure.
correct.
Sure. I'm Dottie Clune, D-O-T-T-I, last name is C-L-U-N-E.
Well, Don, I'm wondering if you could just start off by talking about when you first came to Grand Rapids and kind of what brought you here.
I grew up in northern Michigan, in a small town called Mystic, south of Traverse City, and then went to Michigan State University, lived out of the state for a year or two in the Peace Corps, and then worked for United Press International as a water service reporter. I came here in connection with a relationship. Lived here for a couple of years, then began out of state a couple of years, and then came back in late 70s, early 80s.
Okay, okay. In relationship to your being in Grand Rapids, or coming to Grand Rapids, so you said it was partly in a relationship. I mean, what are some things you remember in, say, the late 70s, early 80s about Grand Rapids in terms of, attitudes and beliefs about how people, accepted or didn't accept folks in the LGBT community? I mean, what do you remember about those early years of being here?
When I first came here, I really was not involved in the LGBT community.
Okay.
And actually, I was married at that time.
Hmm.
And I was more tuned into what was generally going on politically in Grand Rapids. I had grown up in northern Michigan, which is not, depending on where you are in northern Michigan, not necessarily a really progressive area. But I had also just come from Indianapolis, which is at that time was an extremely conservative area. As some people characterized it, the John Lurchers, meaning the Ku Klux Klan, that was kind of the environment there. And I had been involved in progressive work there, but I was very aware of the conservatism there. So when I came to Grand Rapids, in some ways, it was a very interesting transition for me, because having lived in Michigan, I wasn't actually prepared for the religious conservativeness here. That came as a big surprise to me. So even though Indianapolis had been a very conservative area, it didn't have that same element of the religious foundation for the conservative movement here.
Hmm.
Then really where I became increasingly tuned into it was then over the years after I became involved in the LGBT community.
Okay, okay. And were you ever involved in any campaigns or issues that, these are not exclusive, obviously, to the LGBT community, but maybe one that the LGBT community was sort of taking a leadership role in, and whether it was, issues around HIV/AIDS, particularly beginning in the 80s, or the ordinance campaign in the mid-90s in Grand Rapids, or any of those campaigns you were involved in? And if you were, could you talk a little bit about?
Yeah, I remember being involved in the ordinance campaign and meeting with mayoral candidates and being at city commission meetings and that sort of thing. And it's interesting to think of that time now in contrast to where we are now, in terms of things were so much more closed then.
Mm-hmm.
There was so much more fear then that people had about being out. And that was, I think, a much bigger factor in terms of activism, whether or not people felt comfortable being active on issues. I think the other thing that was an influence for me is that by that point I was living in the East Hills area, and the East Hills area really was and continues to be a very progressive neighborhood. And so in some ways, then and now, sometimes there are times when you realize that the feelings I have being in this neighborhood, then when you're not in the neighborhood, the times that things come as a surprise, because you realize we're living in a very open, accepting progressive neighborhood where lots of things can happen that might not happen in other areas, even in this city.
Mhm.
So, but the ordinance campaign was one that I think was an eye-opener in terms of the kinds of barriers that people put up to accepting change and accepting people and differences and.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting in listening to people talk about that period that while they're, Grand Rapids has this, and still has to some degree, this identity as a sort of, kind of ultra-conservative, kind of religious right sort of element to it. But the ordinance passed.
Yes.
I mean, it was a
Yes.
4-3 vote, but it passed.
Yes.
Which certainly spoke to that Grand Rapids wasn't as entrenched in this sort of value system that people perceive. Would you?
Yeah, the ordinance passed here long before it passed in many other cities that people would probably typically think of as being far more progressive. And I think that it's a fascinating thing. Also fascinating, all the activism that was happening at Grand Valley State University at that time. When you put, that early environment at Grand Valley together with the whole ordinance campaign, it presents a different picture of Grand Rapids than what most people would think of, I think.
Yeah.
The other thing that has occurred to me is that when I was living in Indianapolis, one of the things that people used to talk about is that when you live in a very conservative environment, progressive people find each other. And in some ways that can be a very unifying factor. And so I think to a certain extent that may have been true here also. That it brought a lot of, a number of people together to really confront the issues that were going on.
What can you say about what has happened, what has changed over the last 20, 30 years in Grand Rapids in terms of both actual sort of physical space and cultural space that has changed, particularly for the LGBT community? I mean, some people have, mentioned, clubs that they maybe used to gather or other places and organizations that kind of sprung up, choirs and softball leagues and all those kinds of things. So I'm just wondering if you could talk about your own experience about your involvement in any of that, or again, what you've just observed, what has changed, kind of culturally in the area.
That's an interesting line of thinking. I think when I first became involved in the LGBT community, a lot of the activity for women was around softball. Unfortunately, I was never a very good athlete, so that wasn't an option for me. But lots of women have lots of memories of softball games, and that was a way that something that really brought people together. I also came into the community, I think, at an age where the club scene was not necessarily something that I was involved in, but that was a very big and important, played a big and important role, I think, providing a safe place for people and a place for people to meet and socialize, etc. So what is kind of really interesting to think about, I believe, is how much is available now compared to then in terms of LGBT culture, more permeating all different, theater, music, etc. So yes, we do have a women's chorus, we have a gay men's chorus, but also culture that is of particular interest or speaks to the LGBTQ community is now part of lots of other parts of our community. So, integrated into theater and music, and so I think that's sort of an interesting transition.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I've been reading a lot of stuff and talking with other people who around these issues of what people might identify as intersectionality. So, because there's a tendency, and we all do this, but particularly people who don't understand the other, they think that all people care about is one thing. But the very fact that there are people part of the LGBT community who are involved in a whole array of things, particularly a lot of other justice work, because they see how their own liberation is sort of tied up with these other issues. I'm wondering if you talk about that, you know,
Right.
how if that's important to you, if you see that as part of the LGBT community in any way.
And I think that was, those discussions were a big part of network activities at that time, you know, around the time of the ordinance campaign and that sort of thing, that there were lots of conversations about intersections with other groups and other issues, and the importance of people being involved in other issues as well. I also think that, for myself, place plays a key role. And having been now in the East Hills neighborhood for more than 25 years, you know, over time, really the neighborhood activism and other issues became a greater part of my life than working on LGBTQ issues. So it's interesting, I think, to see that transition in various people's lives.
Mm-hmm. I mean, how important has it been for you or other folks in the LGBT community as well, around issues around, you know, whether it's anything from marriage equality to just domestic partner benefits or those kinds of things? Because we've been hearing from people, particularly folks who are a little older, about the importance of, again, more having to do with like economic issues.
Yeah.
About why that's something that's a part of the struggle, that this issue that as people kind of become looking at, you know, how are we going to take care of each other, those kinds of things. I mean, what do you think about those dynamics, you know?
I think that's a very individual kind of perspective that people have. For myself, I see that more, the civil union really to me is the biggest issue, and having those legal and economic rights that, you know, other groups enjoy. You know, from a personal perspective, I don't, the whole involvement of religion in marriage is not important to me, but the notion of having the same rights and benefits of everyone, of others, is important.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I think that what many of us in, you know, my age are really seeing now is that probably people in the LGBT community may be slightly less likely than others to have children. Not that there aren't plenty of LGBT people who have children, but there's still a significant number who don't. And so there's a whole issue of caregiving as people age, and what support systems and services are in place.
Mm-hmm.
And it will be interesting to see how we evolve in that arena here.
Right, right.
A couple of years ago, I was involved in, actually in my work as a consultant, with the creation of the LGBT Resource Center at Grand Valley. And that was a very interesting and rewarding experience, because it was such a powerful example of some of the progress that's been made on these issues. And to see that come to fruition after many, many years of efforts on the part of some key staff people there to make that happen. But I think it's interesting just to see some of these the organizations that have either been created or organizations that have made their own culture more supportive of people in the LGBT community.
I'm just wondering if you could say a little bit more about your role and that time in terms of the helping to sort of form the LGBT Resource Center at Grand Valley. You know, we've interviewed Milt and several other folks from Grand Valley, and of course the LGBT Resource Center is deeply involved in this project. So
Yes.
it'd be just interesting to hear from your point of view, Like, what, what went into sort of making that become a reality?
My business partner, Jeannie Hosey, and I were asked to help with the initial work in creating the resource center. And Milt and others had put in a lot of groundwork over a period of many years. So at the point that we came in, it was primarily to help focus exactly what would the resource center be. And so our work generally, the work that Jeannie and I do generally, involves social issues research. And so we did some research about what were other centers on other campuses, what kinds of activities were they involved in, what were their priorities, that sort of thing. So essentially we were part of the process of looking at what might this resource center be, what areas might it be involved in, and then also in its initial work, creating the guidelines for the center, and helping with the initial startup, the planning, bringing in a group of advisors, and that kind of activity.
Have you, maintained any kind of a role relationship with the center since its creation? And
Not